Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Jeremy McDermott, Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs at NECEC, and we're delighted to have you join us for our first webinar as part of NECEC's Clean Energy Back to Work Challenge. We have a terrific program for you today and an all-star panel. And before we dig into these important issues, I wanted to start with a little bit of a story behind the Clean Energy Back to Work Challenge. As we know, clean energy is a key element to the economic recovery and the way out of the recession and economic challenges posed by COVID-19. And we need to make sure that that recovery is just and equitable, and that we're getting, that populations who have been traditionally disadvantaged are getting access to the benefits of clean energy while are avoiding the environmental harms associated with fossil generation and environmental pollution. NECEC's Clean Energy Back to Work Challenge is an initiative designed to highlight clean energy organizations that have successfully adapted to their business practices amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And since that pandemic has happened, we've lost over 600,000 jobs in the clean energy space across the country. And the Clean Energy Back to Work Challenge is designed to demonstrate new approaches for reversing this trend and getting companies and folks back to work safely. To that end, we invite you and our membership and companies and organizations across the region to submit applications for the Clean Energy Back to Work Awards. There will be an awards ceremony culminating on November 12th, and we encourage you to submit nominations in 5 categories by the 17th of September. Those categories are customer acquisition, innovation of remote work and technology solutions, on-premises construction and installation, greenhouse gas reduction, and public health mitigation, and community engagement during the crisis. We would not be able to do this without terrific sponsors. First, I want to thank our colleagues at Daymark Energy Advisors, who are both great partners in NECEC's work, and also stepped up to sponsor this webinar and to sponsor the Greenhouse Gas and Public Health Mitigation Award. You'll be hearing from Daymark's Vice President of Operations, Kathy Kelly, in just a moment. We're also grateful to all of our sponsors, our community who have provided strong support across the year, but also in particular for this particular challenge. And we are finally grateful to you, our community, for your enthusiasm and for the engagement you bring each and every day. Thank you again for joining us today. As you can see, we have a terrific program today anchored by our all-star cast. In a moment, I'll ask Kathy to set the stage for our discussion, but I wanted to go over a few logistics beforehand. We are putting an emphasis on an interactive exchange of ideas from our panelists with input from you in the audience. To the extent that you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Kathy's going to kick us off, and then each panelist will provide a short overview of where they sit in the world and how they see the challenges of environmental justice and energy infrastructure. And then we'll move quickly to a discussion. Before I ask Kathy to join us, I wanted to just do a quick introduction of each of our panelists. Kathy Kelly is the Vice President of Operations and a Principal Consultant at Daymark Energy Advisors. She's advised utilities, regulators, and large C&I customers on a range of energy issues and has a deep knowledge of a number of across the energy spectrum, including energy efficiency programs deployed for the benefit of low-income customers. Next, we have John Odell, who's the Director of Energy and Asset Management for the City of Worcester. He has over 20 years of energy experience and has been the driving force for countless initiatives in the City of Worcester and understands the challenges of making sure that all citizens get access to clean energy. Then we'll have Eugenia Gibbons, who is the recently anointed Boston Climate Director at Healthcare Without Harm, where she's focused on the intersection of climate policy and public health. Among her duties, Eugenia co-chairs the Climate Justice Working Group of the Massachusetts Climate Implementation Advisory Committee. She's no stranger to climate energy policy, having held leadership positions both at the Green Energy Consumers Alliance and the Environmental League of Massachusetts. And finally, we've got John Abe, the CEO of Sunwealth. Sunwealth is a tech-driven energy investment firm with a firm commitment to bringing energy to underserved communities. John has a deep knowledge and set of experiences as a developer, having worked in leadership positions at Nexamp, as well as at the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust. You'll see we have a great panel today and an engaging topic. And now I'd like to turn it over to Kathy Kelly to provide the first set of remarks, and then we'll get this going. Thank you all for joining. Kathy.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Jeremy. I wanted to just thank NECEC for setting up this opportunity for folks in the industry to be able to get together and talk about these topics and moving the conversation forward. I also want to give a brief apology for Mark Montalvo, who was originally intended to chair this conversation, but unfortunately was called away at the last minute. And I'm very happy and very proud to join you and participate in this discussion. So NECEC asked us to put together a webinar talking about 3 key issues that the industry and the country faces at this point in time. And that is the environmental justice question, social welfare needs, and the intersection of those two with the energy infrastructure decisions being made today and tomorrow. So the discussion here today will be focusing on how to put together policy with justice and welfare around energy infrastructure through the lens of how clean energy projects are developed and deployed today. Some background: DayMark provides an awful lot of advisory services to a variety of participants here today, and also to energy staff who are very, very much in front of these issues. And we like to play in the policy area as well as in the implementation area around trying to address each of these issues. What we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit about the opportunities posed by thinking about these issues and putting them together, and the challenges associated with each of the issues. And I will ask each of the panelists to talk about that from that perspective, and also to bring in the impact of COVID-19 and how that might help lead to additional solutions, how the issue is defined, and then how the issues around racial justice and COVID have helped move this forward within each of their areas of interest and the companies they work for. Let me talk a little bit about the framework around this issue. We have very broad energy goals as a country around decarbonization and the adoption of clean energy and how that fits into our long-term plans. We need to make sure as we do that, that unlike the past, that all sectors of our society have access to clean energy and are treated equally as we implement the clean energy infrastructure. There have been advantages and disadvantages in the past, primarily to low-income segments of our economy. We want to ensure going forward that nobody is left out. That's why this conversation is very timely and requires the introduction of solutions and many more voices to the table. Some of the challenges that we have relative to that we've looked at in the past and that continue to be issues as we go forward. The current housing stock. There are many housing issues, particularly in low-income areas and segments of the economy, but throughout the economy, where the housing stock is unable to address clean energy. For example, the wiring may be old, the roof structure may not be able to hold solar on the roof. There may be upgrades that need to be done in order to be able to allow those housing units to be able to participate. How do you undo the past infrastructure investments to get the infrastructure in place, the energy infrastructure in place to be able to serve all segments of the economy equally. COVID has underscored the inequities. I think all of us have been watching this and participating in those discussions. And we want to make sure that clean energy can address any injustices as we go forward. So I'm going to ask the other participants to please add their perspectives on some of the key issues, the key opportunities and challenges, particularly with respect to their organizations, as well as the economy and society as a whole. So with that, I will bring John Odell into the conversation. John, can you put your screen on, and I'll let you chat for a few minutes.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, Kathy. And thank you all for joining us today. First, I'll start with a quick apology. In the background, there is actually a press conference going on that I was unaware of. So if someone starts clapping arbitrarily, I will presume it's for me, and you can feel free to join in. So start there, but it may interrupt a little bit here too. So forgive if that occurs as well. So the issues that Kathy mentioned are certainly very keen to the city of Worcester as well. In terms of how we deal with sustainability, green energy, and other items related to that, both in terms of how do we address climate change as a whole, as well as this the equity impacts, the social equity impacts that we need to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, where certain parts of the community bear more of the burden than others. And so to that, the city is working on finalizing a Green Worcester plan, which will sort of be the roadmap for how we're going to move forward on this. And I think that's really important, is to first make the distinction that there are two pieces to this. Is that the first is that we want to get as much green energy out there, remove as much waste from the waste stream. We want to make sure our natural systems are enhanced as best we can. And we want to do as much of that as fast as we can. But that also needs to be, it's often easier to do some of those things in areas, frankly, that don't have some of the disadvantages that currently exist, which also, unfortunately, is where some of the social equity piece comes to the forefront. It's easier to build on your strengths than it is to correct your weaknesses. That's where we stand right now. And so those two pieces sometimes aren't working in perfect tandem. We have a tendency to think that we can simply solve some of our climate change problems by just putting in more renewables and removing trash from the waste stream, et cetera, and improving our natural systems, and it will just solve it for everybody. But it's really got to be a much more thoughtful process. And that's where you need to get a plan, and that's what we're trying to do here in Worcester with this Green Worcester plan, is basically target, make sure that what we do, it's not just what we build, but where we build it, that we're targeting disadvantaged communities so that everyone gets the benefits of the improvements to the energy infrastructure, improvements to removing waste from our waste streams, the improvements to our natural resources, new parks, new access for reducing heat island effect, all those kinds of things. So in broad strokes, our plan has like 5 components, and I'll just read them off real quick. But there's the energy component, there's the building and transportation component. That's a critical one. They all are, of course, but that one in particular. Natural systems is on the list. Social equity, and then of course awareness. That's sort of the last piece that we hope ends up taking a more prominent spot on as the successes that we've all had to date. I mean, the city's done a whole bunch of stuff already, but not a whole lot of people know about it. And we know that everyone is generally speaking on board with these ideas. We did a survey, a scientifically based survey. Reached out to 800 people to get their across a wide demographic, a fair representative demographic, to see what people thought about some of these things, and the numbers were pretty impressive, that the vast majority of folks want to ensure that sustainability initiatives provide benefits to all populations, that we incorporate sustainability into the curriculum for city public schools, and that we implement public information campaigns to educate residents about sustainability initiatives so that everyone can participate and actually feel a part of the changes that are being made, and that they're doing their part. It's not out there, it's us, it's all of us. And so that's really the trick of what we're trying to do here at the city, is to start to lay the foundation so that everything we do here, that when we build new infrastructures, when we're talking about improving existing infrastructure, improving existing transportation patterns, when we're looking to put in new parks, reduce heat islands, all those kinds of things, that we have a plan in place already, so that we're not kind of winging it, which is, or worse, we're deliberately doing things that only benefit some and not all of the community. So that's sort of my quick spiel. I could talk on this stuff for an awfully long time, but let me bring it back so that our next speaker can speak to this, Eugenia Gibbons, who's going to be speaking next. So Eugenia, if you could, I will mute myself and bring you on board.
All right, I hope folks can hear me okay. Jeremy, you'll let me know if they can't. So thank you very much for having me today. As was mentioned, my name's Eugenia Gibbons, and I'm the Boston Director of Climate Policy at Healthcare Without Harm. For those who are not familiar with Healthcare Without Harm, we're an international nonprofit organization that works to transform healthcare so that it reduces its environmental footprint, becomes a community anchor for sustainability and resilience, and a leader in the global movement for environmental health and justice. We have a network of over 1,200 hospitals in the US, and we convene the Healthcare Climate Council, which is a leadership body of 19 health systems in 36 states, all of which are committed to climate solutions and protecting public health from the impacts of climate change. I'll note that we also convene a Massachusetts Climate Council, which includes Bay State and UMass Memorial. So I guess the first question is, why do hospitals care about climate change, and why are we taking a proactive step to try to address climate change and equity in the communities where we're located? And it's worth noting that nationally, healthcare accounts for about 10% of overall carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. But the sector also represents about 18% of the GDP. So it's a huge economic engine that can play a vital role in helping communities and the country transition to a low carbon economy. And here in Massachusetts, the healthcare sector is actually the largest employer. We employ about 500,000 people. And the sector also holds a fair amount of real estate across the Commonwealth. So that's all a way of saying when hospitals and hospital systems begin to implement climate strategies and try to address climate change in their own systems, it's actually having a huge impact on the surrounding communities and on the state overall. So many important points were made by Kelly and John already, but I do want to circle back to the discussion of COVID, obviously. And I think it's important to note that the pandemic, from a health perspective, has certainly reinforced the link between air quality and poor health outcomes. So there's been lots of research done over years that points to this connection, but now it's it's undeniable that there are significant links between air pollution and health outcomes. And we also have evidence that points to the fact that communities, certain communities are more vulnerable to these health effects, low-income communities and communities of color. And certainly in Massachusetts, we've seen COVID has disproportionately affected low-income communities, communities of color, communities who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate pollution, of poor air pollution, of climate change, the risks of climate change. They've been ravaged by COVID. And so when we think about how to address this going forward, we really have to move away from the impulse to think about climate action as strictly an exercise in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and really try to anchor the work in the communities and anchor the work around people, so that when we're thinking through what a transition will look like to a clean energy future, we're doing kind of what John was saying, taking a holistic view, a holistic approach, and considering greenhouse gas emissions, who has access to clean resources, who is already overburdened by the existing system, and how do we make sure that that burden is reduced or eliminated overall? What are the job growth and economic growth opportunities within communities? And for hospitals in particular, as anchor institutions, what role can hospitals and education universities and others, anchor institutions, really play in not only initiating this work on the ground, but helping to scale it up quickly? And that could be the build out of renewable electricity supply. That could be rapid adoption or accelerating adoption of energy efficiency measures. It could have to do with food supply and industrial processes. There are so many different things that fit into this clean and just transition that are not strictly about electricity or GHG emissions. The last thing I'll mention is I see real opportunity going forward, and this is coming out of COVID, but was kind of started before COVID, but certainly a lesson learned from COVID, is there are opportunities going forward to properly value the health benefits of clean energy solutions, and particularly of energy efficiency and weatherization, as those things affect indoor air quality as well as outside and air pollution and air quality as well. But if we properly value the health benefits of these measures and these resources, especially for people who are already overburdened by the pollution and who are already susceptible to respiratory illness, circulatory illness, premature death caused by pollution, then we are able to move forward faster in driving the adoption of some of these measures and these solutions. And I don't know if I'm about to run out of time, but when we circle back to the discussion, I'll give some examples of things that are underway in our backyard in terms of the role that hospitals are playing to help drive some of this change. The last thing I'll mention, though, is we don't yet know, none of us know yet, sort of the full impact of the pandemic. And the sector that I work with certainly doesn't know that either. Even before the pandemic, hospitals were operating on very tight margins and were doing good things around clean energy and climate change despite tight margins. But COVID has caused so many costly disruptions to supply chain, obviously surges in acute care and patient needs. There's loss of revenue associated with the suspension of elective procedures. And so all of this means that there's going to be a reevaluation going forward in every sector, but certainly in the healthcare sector, to try to figure out, how do we make these things work, and how do we make these things, how do we make solutions possible? And for my money, at least in the energy efficiency and clean energy space, those sorts of solutions often pencil out, and they are good investments, not only for public health reasons, but also because they're money-saving measures that have long-term benefits as well that can be quantified. So I'm hopeful that we will not lose any ground in working to clean up our sector going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Abe, who will speak specifically about a particular type of clean energy that we're working to support. So John, if you want to take yourself off mute.
You're still on mute, John. There you go.
Can you guys hear me? Thank you.
Yes, we can.
Great. So thank you very much, Eugenia and John.
John, you've gone on mute again.
Okay. How's
There you
this?
go.
Can you hear it?
Yes, thank you.
So the saying that a fact does not become a truth until you love it, you know, I think the same is true for problem solving and addressing issues such as climate change and social justice. And I don't think any of the solutions that we talk about have a chance until people in organizations fall in love with them. And at Sunwealth, I get to work with a team and dozens of partners that love solving both climate change and racial justice problems, you know, sometimes just one challenging solar project at a time. And so at Sunwealth, we manage and finance small and medium solar projects, and we work extensively with local installers, local businesses, not-for-profits, houses of worship, government, affordable housing, especially those in underserved communities. John Odell, one of my favorite solar projects remained our mustard seed soup kitchen project. It's one of our smallest as well. It's a 10 kilowatt project in Worcester. And this project saves the mustard seed soup kitchen about $800 per year. And you know, that might not seem a lot of money, but for a small soup kitchen that services a large homeless population, you know, when we ask them about it, they're like, going into the fall and the winter, that allows us to buy 400 new clean, dry wool socks for our constituents. And since 2014, we've developed about 150 projects. We've deployed $50 million into them across 8 states, and we have another $25 million under construction. There's a saying that, you know, capitalists are good at growing the pie but not sharing it, and socialists are good at sharing the pie but not growing it. And well, at Sunwealth, we strive to grow solar pies and share them with our project partners. So this might be providing clear power purchase savings or lease revenue to not-for-profits such as Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corp, where we have a project, or the Falmouth Fire Department, where we have 2 projects. We work extensively with local installers to ensure that they're getting fair margins and able to pay good wages to their teams. And of course, we want to make sure that our impact investors get their return. And thus far, we have over 22 quarters of meeting or exceeding target returns and 0 defaults from our 150 power purchase agreement customers across the country. And the pandemic has showed that, you know, everything is really hard for everyone, but solar development, finance, and construction is pretty resilient. Early on in many states, solar was deemed an essential service. And so while it was complicated, I think it was relatively easy compared to other businesses to implement the appropriate safety measures at the job sites. And so, you know, the Sunwealth team is a diverse, almost 20 strong now. Most of us are working virtually, but we do go to job sites. And I'm pleased to say that at this moment, we have over a dozen installers and developers in the field employing over 100 electricians and installers at various sites from coast to coast. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John, and thank you, John, Eugenia and Kathy, I want to invite our panelists to turn on their microphones and their videos so we can start to engage in the conversation. And the first question I wanted to ask you all is, I mean, the COVID pandemic and the increased attention and the dialogue around racial justice has brought attention to and sort of brought the stark discrepancies around a number of elements of our society into stark relief. And it's also true in environmental justice, burdens and access to clean energy both. What do you think how is COVID going to provide, well, let me start over. Have you seen good examples of action to follow from this attention, and how do we maintain that momentum?
Sure, I can
long wind up.
jump in there quickly. I think nationally there have been groups who've been trying to make the connection between environmental justice or injustice in health and climate for multiple decades, right? A movement was based on that. I think we're starting to see in the policy realm, we're starting to see more and more attention being paid to the role that states can play in establishing environmental justice protections in statute. So even in Massachusetts, our House just overwhelmingly passed an energy bill that included environmental justice language, and that bill's now in conference, and hopefully we'll see it go all the way through the process. New Jersey just passed EJ language. I believe Virginia did recently. And the reason why that's important, and certainly that's important here in Massachusetts, is because all of the clean energy and climate policies and programs that we're thinking about and that we're trying to move forward all reference EJ communities. So when we're thinking about how to invest dollars that come for transportation, for example, and we're saying we need to prioritize environmental justice communities, well, we need to know how that community is defined. What does that term mean? And how do we collectively reach an agreement to target investment in those communities so that we're trying to undo some of the damage that's been done over time by directing clean energy solutions and prioritizing investment in clean energy solutions in the places where folks have been overburdened for multiple generations. So I think that's one example in the policy space. I'd welcome what others are seeing.
I would also add to that, Eugenia. I think there's been a number of places in the United States where we have seen that there have been partnerships built between the private and the public or the policy world. For example, in New York, there's an opportunity zone program that encourages private investment that allows low-income and rural folks to be able to get access to clean energy and actually install clean energy. And getting that private-public partnership in place is an important role for folks to make sure that the policies can get implemented. There's also similar things happening in Washington, D.C., where they're looking for public and private investment together in the communities that have no access to clean energy. So I think one nice thing would be for each of the panelists to talk about how at your business and your facility, you are looking at that ability to marry policy with the private investment community and how that can work to help move this forward. I'll open it up to any of the three of you.
Well, sorry, I have an answer, so I'm going to jump in. But feel free to check me if I'm talking too much. So for the hospital sector, we're always thinking about community resilience and facility resilience, right? We have to stay open. Hospitals have to stay open in the midst of a crisis. They have to be able to serve people. Safe haven in the storm type of model. And so facility resilience is almost really obvious. Community resilience is different, and that absolutely takes, Kathy, the type of partnership that you're talking about, a public-private partnership engaging with folks on the ground. I think a really good example of this is the Evergreen Co-op in Cleveland, Ohio, was a model where anchor institutions partnered with local groups and folks on the ground to invest in key industries and businesses, and then built up a local economy around that. And that has been replicated in Springfield with the Wellspring Cooperative, I believe is what it's called. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with it, but they should look up Wellspring Cooperative. And it's a very similar model where, for example, Bay State is an anchor partner. There are community partners or business partners or anchor institutions, and they have collaborated to create a space where there's a prioritization of, a priority is placed on growing a green economy and making sure that it's accessible to as many people as possible. So there's a workforce development component, there's a clean jobs component, an energy reduction, a clean food. It's all about creating access to many of the pieces of a clean economy and ensuring that folks are well represented and are part of the process, as opposed to being an afterthought.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, and that's all really good stuff. Is that from the city's perspective, because it's a little different, obviously, than a private institution by default. It's more on the city side. We're trying to predominantly through this plan is to do two things. Is that the plan itself sort of requires that there's a filtering process of people that represent the community as a whole, so that projects and policies that we put in place or contemplating putting in place are being reviewed by the people that it will affect, not just from up top deciding this is what you guys need to the community at large, but actually bringing the community in so that it's a more holistic approach. The second thing is that when you cite these things, the planning boards and zoning boards all need to work together so that we understand what the impacts of this can be, both good and bad. We try to think of that most green projects are predominantly good, and I think that's the case, but there are impacts, even negative impacts potentially even with those, and those need to be addressed too. I mean, people maybe really for something, but there's often, yeah, that's great, but not right next to me kind of attitude. That is prevalent not just in the wealthier side of town, but also in the less wealthy side of town. And so those kinds of issues need to be addressed and thought of in the process. And that's really one of the fundamental things that we're trying to do in the city, is that the process itself needs to be thought of and more deliberately than it is now. The processes for getting things done, both I would argue both from a governmental side but also from a private industry side, is not necessarily brings to the table all the players, all the constituents that are going to be affected by what's going to be done. And that's the real key, is that we end up making sure that the decisions that affect people are going to be, at least in part, made by the same people that will be affected by them. Both the ones directly, of course, those are the obvious ones, but also to a real extent, the ones that are indirect, because that affects the whole, which is what we're all talking about here, is that's how this problem gets solved, is we got to do it together, and therefore you got to look at it together.
So John,
before we hop in, I want to make sure that folks start getting their questions going and putting them into the Q&A box. We're going to be turning to audience questions in just a second. And now, Kathy, back over to you.
Great, thank you. John, I just wanted to follow up on the City of Worcester's clean energy plan. How are you getting the right people to the table? What outreach are you using to make sure that enough voices are there and the right voices are at that table? And what suggestions do you have for other entities that are trying to do this?
That's a great question, and that's key. And so initially, when we put together this plan has there's a working group of about 20 of us total, of which 12 or so were active participants at different periods of time during this. And it was selected. It was selected in two ways. Part of it was we knew there were some players we just needed on the team. And so we reached out, we just called those people to see if they could join us. But then there was the more who else do we need kind of thing, where we would ask the community as a whole who do we think needs to be part of this, and how can you help? And we'd ask a series of questions to on social media to reach out to different blocks of the community, and got their feedback as to different people that might be good fits and why. And then from that, selected a group that we thought made a pretty good cross representation. The thing is, of course, it's tricky because, you know, you can put something like out there, and my first fear was that you're going to get a whole bunch of people who have little to no knowledge of what that is, but are interested, and they may not be the exact players you want on the team. You need someone who's got some specific knowledge about this. You want your doctor to have gone to medical school. You don't let, you know, someone else doctor for you. You don't want your plumber to be fixing your leg when you hurt your leg. So it's the same idea. You want people with some expertise. But on the other hand, you do need that cross section of people who can look at it from a different perspective, not just the same faces that you often get on all these things all the time. So managing those expectations of making it broad, but not so broad that it becomes unwieldy, is a trick. And it's a trial and error. Anyone who has a fail-safe method for determining that, I'd love to hear it. But it's a challenging process.
I just wanted to add one point really quickly. Sorry, Jeremy, which is, first of all, John, it's like you're dropped out of heaven. I love everything you're saying. Yes, it's important also to remember that sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And a lot of times community building and community engagement requires that you take a little bit of time to try to bring in those key partners, bring in those different perspectives, build camaraderie, build trust, and then you can move forward together. And I think often when we're thinking about climate planning, certainly at the state level, we are constrained by timelines, by milestones and deliverables that need to be met. We're all stressed about the urgency of climate change and the need to act quickly, but it's very easy to lose sight of the importance of bringing in different people so that the solutions that get finalized and ultimately implemented actually work for people. It's a totally different thing between, like, I can design a perfect policy. It doesn't mean when it gets implemented, it's going to look anything like what was on the whiteboard when we designed it. So it's important to take the time.
John Abe, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about how you find the intersection of the projects that you're implementing and trying to address some of the concerns that we're talking about today.
Sure. So I think one of the advantages that Sunwealth has is that from the bottom up, we are built to address climate change and racial justice. It's like walking and chewing bubblegum to us. And so it's important to note that that begins with our corporate investors, leadership, and our charter. So I'm sure many of you heard of the concept of benefit corporation. That's the not-for-profit, volunteer, you're a benefit corporation. It's kind of like putting on your superhero costume. We've taken it one step farther, where we are a Delaware chartered public benefit corporation. So by law, as a CEO, I'm basically required to balance profit motive with doing good and fulfilling our mission of building an inclusive solar economy. And so any corporation or organization that's serious about addressing these issues, I always tell them, like, get to the roots of what the mission of your company is and revisit them. So what that's enabled us to do is build a very diverse team, build credibility and trust with the community partners that we work with. And what I think I learned is, though, it's really never enough. So there's a blog on our website that my partner Omar Bladen wrote called "Do Something," and what we did was we examined all of our policies, but more we examined the results of those policies. And I think that to complement the work that Eugenia and John and the NGO and government sectors are doing, businesses really need to step up. And so we went through our team and our hiring practices. And so while we are diverse by clean energy standards, we're like, can we do more? And re-examine all of our processes. Can we do more to support first generation college graduates? And we have these open discussions from top to bottom across our team around it. The second thing is on the projects, where our projects are located and who are they benefiting. And so one of the metrics we're most proud of, for every dollar we invest, it creates about 60 cents of long-term energy savings or lease payments for our partners. And over 40% of our projects are located in designated low-income communities. And that's an indicator that most of those benefits is flowing into those communities, but there's always more for us to do. Around partners, who installs, who designs, who engineers these, we're really proud to work with the local fabric of the solar economy, recognizing that there isn't a ton of diversity there. And so when we look at this problem, our thinking is like, well, you know what? In 2021, we need to seed fund a Black-owned solar installation business or development business here in Massachusetts, because there isn't one. And so we're going to work on that. On the policy side of things, we really figure out where we want to allocate our limited policy resources. And it's not going to be on interconnection issues. It's going to be on low-income community solar and inclusion issues here in Massachusetts, where, frankly, we think that the administration and even the legislature hasn't done enough. There was an opportunity for them to fix the SMART program, but I think they just weren't in love with the idea of addressing that, and they focused all their attention and resources on addressing land issues, when by tweaking 10 words, and many of the people listening to this call, including NECC, signed on to the support letter to do that. So there's simple fixes that sometimes folks in leadership position lose sight of. So, the other thing is, going back to do something, when I talk to other CEOs and I have these virtual conference calls, and I'm like, wow, you look good. They're like, thanks, really busy through the pandemic, but I've been doing 10 hours of fitness. They're like, how do you do the social justice things? And I'm like, well, allocate one of those 10 hours a week to, to focusing on social justice. And the other thing is like, well, I want to be really careful and thoughtful and not make any mistakes. And I'm like, you're an entrepreneur. You started off with an app that was going to identify hot dog stands, and now you're, using your app and software to fix energy efficiency issues. Like, try something, do something. You're smart. Focus less on making mistakes and more on what you can do. And, that's kind of the view we have around the business world.
Great, thanks.
John, you're fired up.
I know, Jeremy, you've got questions.
Yeah, I want to turn to a couple of audience questions, but I think, the lesson is sort of it takes leadership from the top. It takes a long-term commitment and a desire and a willingness to get in and have the complicated conversations and bring a disparate set of voices to the table in a way that's not always comfortable. One question that came up from our audience is around, the healthcare industry, as evidenced by Eugenia, and Healthcare Without Harm are doing very impressive things with clean energy. Are there other industries that have a high potential to implement clean energy solutions that you all are seeing? And maybe Kelly, Kathy Kelly, that's a question for you and your client base.
I think every industry can contribute, in fact, to providing a more clean energy future, and one in which it can address all the social issues that we've been discussing today. I mean, particularly the water and wastewater industry comes to mind. I mean, they affect every home. They have the ability to get into homes and make things in the infrastructure more able to address some of these issues. I'm also thinking that as we go through this, just the general buildings ownership, like BOMA in Boston and that sort of thing, they have lots of programs whereby they try to help building owners make their buildings more efficient. That's a place where they can begin to address this issue of where their buildings are within the low-income neighborhoods or even abutting them, and how they can partner with those neighborhoods to perhaps do community solar. or some kind of community thing using the buildings that they own and manage. I think there's a broad base of industries that it's going to take to make this happen. It is not simply any of the industries we're in, it's all of us, no matter what we do. Others?
I think you're right. I think there's opportunity for everybody to get into the game of clean energy and climate action, and more importantly of socially just clean energy and climate action. I can drop into the list examples of announcements that have been made recently. I mean, I think if anything, the combination of COVID and racial justice fights happening in our country right now have forced a lot of organizations and businesses to have kind of like a come to Jesus moment and say, we're either prioritizing this or we're not. And so we're seeing a lot more people make those commitments, and whether or not they follow, it's up to all of us to hold them accountable to following through. But yeah, I agree with Kathy. I think there's opportunity for all industries to not only benefit from energy efficiency and clean energy PPAs and on-site renewables, but also it's going to take policy too. Policy's got to play a role in sort of mandating these things to make them happen sooner, because the reality is, while John is doing great work, most CEOs are very risk averse, and so they don't want to take that risk on, and they need some prodding, some nudging, or they just need John in their ear reminding them to do it every day, which I would take too.
One other question that we've received is the role of microgrids and community microgrids in particular in addressing some of these equitable access to clean energy questions, and maybe John Odell, are you seeing opportunities in Worcester and I guess for healthcare facilities too? It's an option.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. In fact, we're working with the Mass Clean Energy Center on a proposal that just came through for the WRTA, the Regional Transit Authority, that serves predominantly Worcester, but also many of the communities surrounding Worcester as well, with local bus service. And how do we make the buses available during challenging times when power may not be available, when other things may be happening, and at the same time make the fleet of buses that they have more energy efficient, run on electricity, and provide the charging stations that are needed at potentially schools, so that the schools now have a redundant power supply as well. And that could even tie in with solar that's on some of our schools now, but having the battery supply and the charging capacity for the buses there, but could also be used by the local community. So you can create some islands, if you will, in and around some of these school areas. And so we just got the results from that, actually, coincidentally, yesterday, the study. And the study's saying that it is financially feasible. The benefits for every dollar we invest, we're going to get back as much as $1.50 in terms of energy savings and other benefits. That's the kind of policy that we want to pursue, those kinds of things. And there's lots of opportunities like that, but that's just an easy microgrid. Not I went easy. That's a misstatement.
Those words are never connected.
Take that back. It's not easy, but it's possible, and it's something that can work. And it's really doing the homework up front, which does take time and money, which is part of the equation. Because I mean, John's point earlier was, I think, well made, is that you do sometimes have to take those risks that you're going to fail, even when it costs money and your time, because the potential upsides are where it's really at. I mean, that's what we got to be thinking about. I mean, if you fail 3 times but hit one and get one project that really works, you can easily recoup those costs in those first 3 and then some. You just got to be willing to do those all 4 tries and not know if your success rate will be in the first one or the 4th one. And that's just the way it works. And it's the same thing from the city and communities. I mean, governments in general are very, very, very risk averse, because it's tax money. It's not our money. But that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be doing that and pursuing the policies that allow entrepreneurs and businesses, current businesses, to pursue those policies, those ideas, even when they risk failing, that we can be there to help support. Yeah, that didn't work, but if you did this and this and this, maybe that would help. And we partner up with them so that we can make sure that those ideas, the germ of the idea at least, is saved, and we figure out a way to make it work.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes and get out there and get in the arena and engage in the discussion and learn from those mistakes.
Exactly.
I guess the last question, we're getting towards the close of our hour, and we have a couple young people, some of whom are on screen and some who aren't, asking about the role of education and what even younger folks can do to get involved. And maybe what we do is sort of go down and have a parting thought from each of you before I turn it over to Kathy to give a summary of what is the engagement for young people, and what advice would you give to young folks who want to get engaged? We'll go from John Abe to Eugenia to John Odell, and then Kathy will give us a summary benediction, as it were.
So, it's the John Adams quote, what he told his kids. It's not enough for you to be good. It's really important, especially given where the world is today, for you to go out and think about doing good every day.
I agree with that. I would say there are lots of examples of the youth leading things right now, and actually maybe the best advice is for some of the more seasoned folks to take a step back and allow the youth to lead. For the little ones, I saw one question about how to engage a 6-year-old. I mean, there are many ways. I bring my kids can probably explain wind power better than most adults I know. So the fact that your little one is watching this webinar today is a great first step, and there are plenty of ways to keep them interested and keep them engaged. And to the point of education for older folks, I mean, college students or programs, learn about redlining, learn about environmental justice, learn about these issues, and then, but more importantly, figure out who are the organizations on the ground who are working to address these things, and learn from them, because you're going to learn more from the people doing the work than you will in the classroom.
Yep, that's exactly right. So 2 pieces just to emphasize what Eugenia just said in particular is there's lots of organizations out there now that you can reach out to participate more. But if you're for the younger set, for the kids still in school, I think that's critical. And part of that, the problem is that there's a disconnect between how we teach in some ways in terms of what we're able to teach, because we're teach a lot toward what's required on the MCAS tests. I'm not saying we don't need MCAS tests, but I am saying that can't be the only driver for what gets taught our kids. Everyone here who has kids can certainly attest that when a kid gets something, your child gets something in their head and they're interested in it, it sort of envelops the household, because that's just what kids do. And it's awesome. It's amazing. So with that in mind, if you can bring those kinds of opportunities to kids in the schools, you infect, if you will, the whole family, which in turn infects the whole community. And so it's really critical that we make the policies in place that allow that to happen, both on the local level, but also state and even federal to some degree. So that's really something that we can all participate in. We have legislators who can have direct impact on this, and you can, it sounds old-fashioned, but you write your letter, you write your email, that has impact. It's surprising. They get less than you think. Your words can actually have more impact on these folks than you would originally probably, as I sometimes jadedly think, doing what I've been doing for a while in government. But it's amazing how much power that is, especially en masse. So I would certainly encourage that too.
And
thank you all, Kathy.
Yep.
Yeah, Kathy, please.
I just want to thank everybody, all the panelists who have participated today. This is a very hot topic and a topic that we need to make sure we do not lose sight of. I think what I heard today is that we have a lot of policies in place, and we have, as an industry, used top-down type of solutions, but we also are seeing from the panelists here the bottoms-up solutions as well, and that I've heard that in order to make these solutions work, we need to get more and more involvement, even from students using some of the suggestions here. We need to get corporate involvement in order to find funding, and also to make sure that we get private investors involved. We need a broad cross-section of everybody who's interested to find a means to shape a dialogue that gets us all moving in the same direction, even though we're all coming at it from different perspectives. We need to make sure that our policies include low income and access for low income to be able to be part of the solution and make sure that the organizations are credible and can be trusted. So I think it's been a great discussion. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And Jeremy, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. Really, we could have this conversation for a lot longer, and I think a lot of the table is set, but there's a lot more work to do. And I think John Abe's sort of words of sort of getting out there and being not afraid to act in a good way, and just being good makes sort of the marching orders for all of us. I did want to sort of bring everybody's attention to a couple of upcoming events that were associated with the Clean Energy Back to Work Challenge. We're having another webinar on September 15th, also a noontime start. So keep your eyes peeled for that. That's 2 days before the nomination deadline for award nominations for the challenge. And then again, that virtual award ceremony will take place on November 12th. A couple of other upcoming events at NECEC. We have a hydrogen summit on September 22nd, followed by the Cleantech Open Northeast Regional Finals on October the 1st. And then again, the dates relative to the Back to Work Challenge. Again, thank you so much to Daymark and our panelists. This is a great conversation, one that we need to continue. And thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to continued engagement at the next one. Be well, everybody. Thank you.
Be well. Thank you.
Thank you.